Renshaw.
It is, yeah.
So cool, man, for agreeing to join me. I saw you're from the northwest of London, or England. I was a little bit
Hmm.
nervous that I wasn't going to understand you. You have a real thick Scottish accent or something, but you seem okay.
No, that's north of the wall, as we say. That's Scotland. Yeah,
All right.
I'm from Liverpool originally, but my accent is a lot slower than what it used to be when I lived there. So I have to slow it down for people around Manchester. There's only 40 miles difference between Manchester and Liverpool, but there's a massive difference in accents, bizarrely.
That's
So,
like that all the way around, isn't it?
yeah.
And it's like accents are. I mean, you can pretty much tell where somebody's from and their class. I mean, that's what I've heard anyway. We don't really have that down here. I guess we do in a way. It's more subtle. It's more based on education and how much money you have. So you're an artist, right? Are you a writer also, or just primarily an illustrator?
Both. So a writer and artist, but um, sometimes I'll do stuff for other people to do, but majority of the time I'm writing for myself, really.
Okay.
Or I'll rewrite other people's work. So there's a couple of projects which I've got on at the moment where the original script has come from a writer who may not be that familiar with working in comics. So I've kind of sat down with them and reworked it so it works better in the format for comics, which is I
You
always find quite enjoyable.
are you drawing his work, or are you just rewriting his work to be drawn by somebody else?
In the three projects which I've got on at the moment, I'm rewriting it to draw for myself. So a lot of it's more kind of a lot of people who aren't familiar with writing comics tend to do multiple actions or descriptions of multiple actions to take place in one picture. So like
Hmm.
a classic one is Frank Miller years ago when he was working on Daredevil in the 80s. It was a panel where Daredevil's running across a room, jumping out of a window, onto the fire escape, down into the alleyway, and then jumping over a car. So he does that in one panel, but it's like multiple versions of Daredevil doing it.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. Like Spider-Man will do the same thing. He'll
Yeah,
bound down a pole, flip over it, hit a car, bounce off of that. Yeah, Marvel's real famous for that kind of stuff, isn't it?
yeah. It's just just showing the movements and telling the movements in one panel. Whereas, let's say, a lot of people who may not be familiar with writing for comics will just kind of assume something like that can happen with someone walks across the room, opens a door, we look inside, what's in the door or the fridge or something, and then but it gets kind of confusing. So all I do is basically just chop it up and go, well, you need to see the person go into the place where you're going to. You need to see what he's looking at inside the fridge. You need to see the person's reaction, just break it up a little bit like that. But then it
Are
becomes,
you are you one of those people who think that that I mean, can you? I tried to write comics. I mean, it's incredibly hard to do. It's just incredibly hard to do. Would you recommend somebody be an artist before getting into the writing aspect of it? Because I mean, it's so specific and special.
I think it would definitely help. It's a bit like if you're an actor and then become directing, you kind of know then the language of actors almost, or you know what actors may need from their director. So in the same way that as an artist, then you'll know, or as a writer, you'll know what the artist will need from you.
Hmm.
And I often use film analogies for comics because they are quite similar in that kind of way.
Very similar, yeah.
But yeah, I think it helps. Grant Morrison was an artist originally before he started becoming a writer. Alan Moore was a cartoonist as well. Um,
Stan Lee, did he draw at all before he did his? He was just a writer, wasn't he?
I think he became just a writer, but I think he did do some drawing beforehand. Um, I'm not entirely sure on that one, but I know like the Marvel method originally for like the Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko and things like that
Hmm.
were relatively. It was more of a loose type of thing because they knew each other so well. Just let you come in with an outline and I'll see you at 6 o'clock type of thing. But I'm pretty sure he would have done some drawing beforehand. But you tend to find a lot of writers start off that way and then for whatever reason get more drawn towards the writing side.
Well, you're also a publisher too, aren't you?
Yeah, back in the day. So when I finished university in 1999, I got more into the self-published side of it because at the time there was a handful of self-publishers around doing stuff which I was quite interested in, stuff that you would never see from like a big corporate type of publisher.
Hmm.
Some of it might be more kind of political or violent than what you would normally get away with. And then I would go to a couple of conventions. There was a big one in Manchester in '97, which had Alex Ross in it. They just brought out Uncle Sam. Joe Kubert was there. There's quite a lot of big names at the time, which for Manchester was quite rare. We wouldn't normally get kind of the top A list of people coming over at that time. So I went along, and all of a sudden there's this massive new world of comics which have opened before me, type of thing. So at that time, I was looking for something a bit more challenging than just your kind of standard superhero type of stuff. And then
Is that still the case in Manchester? Is it pretty wild in terms of who you can get out there to talk to you in the con world?
well, with conventions, it's more in Britain. It's kind of split between kind of the big, well, Comic Cons. The kind of is a loose term we tend to use over here. It's not endorsed by like San Diego Comic Con or anything like that. But
Oh,
we have
gotcha.
a couple of big ones like MCM and stuff like that. Where so the conventions tend to fall into kind of two groups really. It's the bigger ones, or the ones that take up the most space, are ones which will have say 15-20% of actual comic book people, and then the rest of dealers which are selling toys or t-shirts,
Mhm.
and then a lot of cosplayers, which is fine if that's what you're into. Or there'll be a lot of like TV actors and people like that from Lost or Star Trek or whatever it may well be, Supernatural and things like that. And
Are
then on the other
you
side,
are you an old school con goer? I mean, you said, when did you start getting into going to cons?
um, with those types of cons, probably late '90s, when I had a bit of money
Late
to actually
90s.
to go to these types of things. With not being able to drive, it's always kind of relying on public transport, trains, and things like that. So, but Manchester was the first big one I went to, and that was a big eye opener. And then after that, further down south, you've got Bristol, which is on the west coast of Britain, which is a bit of a trek for someone going to up north. And then London, they have the bigger ones. But the other side of the conventions where you've got people who are, it's more comic book focused. You still have dealers, you still have cosplayers and stuff like that. And that's fine. But the focus then is on the writers and the artists. The panels are based on what they're doing. It's a lot more kind of not intimate, but a lot more kind of easygoing, where you're more likely to bump into like an A-lister writer or artist at the bar that you're staying in the hotel in anyway, and you can just have a chat with them. So as long as people, aren't too forward or aren't too drunk or anything like that. So Jim Lee, for example, came down a few years ago to Bristol, and he was just sitting there having a smoke in the bar, and there's loads of people that he knew around, and he's like, oh, hello, yeah, and it was really really laid back. Whereas I would imagine if you go to one of the like San Diego or something like that, you wouldn't be able to have that kind of interaction with them. That kind
Well,
of
yeah,
one to
New
one.
York, that's where I'm at. You wouldn't know where they are, right? The convention
Yeah.
center is on the other side of town, and you could say anywhere
Mm.
in New York and get to that convention center. Yeah, the cosplaying is interesting, right? I mean, that's a huge part of the New York Comic Con thing, and it gets crowded, gets really crowded. I love being able to walk up and down the indie aisles and be able to talk to the artists and the writers, and the cosplayers. They kind of get in the way of that. Do you consider yourself an indie?
Yeah, I suppose by definition, really, I am, because although I've done, so I've been working, um, working in comics or small press, independent comics in the UK since about 99, 2000, really. I did my own stuff with Engine Comics and my own few titles, and then I've done work for fanzines, I've done work for smaller publishers. Um, so again, it's a weird kind of difference where the terms are differently applied over here than what they are in the US. So like independents are ones where they have usually higher production quality in terms of paper and printing, bigger distribution through Diamond, and you may get some money on it, like a page rate type of thing. Whereas small press are usually people who like do photocopies, like A5 folded over photocopies. But even now, small press comics, because the price of printing's gone down so much in the last 20 years or so,
Has it really?
um,
Okay, interesting.
uh, over here, the actual quality of the small press now has gone right up to something indistinguishable that you would find in a normal comic shop. I think also a lot of people have not had the experience that I had growing up with, because I grew up with a lot of newsstand weekly comics anthologies, like we obviously 2000 AD most people are aware of, but you'd have a lot of war comics like Warlord and Victor and Eagle at that time as well. So there's a huge raft of newsstand comics that I grew up with, which are usually say 4 pages per story per
Hmm.
issue. So very short kind of shots of story really. And then the American stuff I kind of got into in my kind of mid-teens when I discovered the comic shops in Liverpool at the time, and I'd be able to get into like Marvel, DC. And then again after that, it was more kind of the wider range of indie type stuff from America.
Yeah.
which were dealing like the Cerebus at the time and Terry Moore and people like that. I was like, oh, you can do this with comics. This is amazing. So, it's kind of like 3 or 4 different stages. Whereas a lot of kids, say kids, I'm in my 40s, so everyone's a kid. So to me, so when you see like new people coming into conventions for the first time and they're selling their own stuff, they've not had that kind of upbringing where they've been exposed to those types of storytelling. A lot of it may well be through the internet or through manga or other avenues. So the stuff that they're producing is unique to them really in their experience. Whereas stuff from my generation will still have a bit of an echo almost of that style of storytelling, which is quite quick, quite condensed. Whereas American storytelling in a normal American comic, 28 pages per issue usually, will be more kind of spread. What's the word? Decompressed storytelling. So
It's interesting because back in the day when you were growing up, I'm about the same age,
Mhm.
43. And back in the day when you talked about indie comics, you were talking about stuff that you had to find, you had to dig out.
Yeah.
You found somebody new that was doing something interesting. They were doing something hard, right? They were drawing this thing, they were writing this thing, and they were printing this thing out and distributing it also. And if you found it and people were talking about it, it was kind of a miraculous thing. Nowadays, I was thinking about the excuse me, the 4-page, war comics that you were talking about. That perfect place for those are on the internet, right? It's the best place for them in the entire world, but then they get swallowed up by everybody else. So they're no longer special. They would be at one point if you did all the other parts that went along with it, right? Is that what it makes like the successful thing, doing all the parts, do you think?
Um, in terms of on the internet or in print, sorry, do you
Like
mean?
in terms of the fan, right? I mean, in terms of the
Mhm.
people that are going to find you, like it's easy now to write the thing and put it on the internet and then it disappears. But why were these people so important back in the day when you were digging them out of the indie scene? When you got excited about seeing them, they were special, right? Is it still possible to be special in that way?
I think it is absolutely. It's a weird thing about what catches on now in terms of what becomes popular or viral, in that kind of sense. Whereas back in the day, it was you had, let's say, the newsstand stuff was always there. That was just like the staple, and then you could dig stuff out in a box somewhere in a comic shop, and then the indie
Hey,
stuff, which
for you guys though, because I don't even know what the new Sam would be like for me, or do you know if there's a crossover from the States to the UK? So at that point, when we were kids, when we were both teenagers, there was no crossover, right? I discovered Space in 2015 or something, and fell in love with it and watched the hell out of it.
oh yeah,
There was no way for me to watch Space before
yeah.
2000. You know what I mean? It was this great show that existed that I heard about that I couldn't wait to see. And if somebody had a VHS, great, but you probably weren't going to find somebody with a VHS. I mean, that's how disconnected we were. Did we have newsstand stuff?
Yeah, in America, but what again, it's different terms. In America, newsstand would be Marvel and DC, and then you'd have like
But
going
that's like
back
a
to
28-page book, though. Those are like big, full, like monthly type situations.
yeah, but that would be classed in the day, kind of 70s and 80s as newsstand, and then
Well,
is as time's gone on in the 80s, this idea of direct market where you'd have specialized comic shops selling stuff rather than like little corner shops or mom and pop type of stores.
the comic book
Um,
store. They
yeah,
came
so
around.
like a Pacific comic store that you'd actually go to, and then you'd have then from that you have to change like Flippin' Planet and Mile High and people like that start to grow over time. So now, as a lot of people already know, Previews, which is the main distributor of, well, for the time being anyway, there's a bit of a weird situation at the moment in the industry. Diamond, for the last, say, 20 odd years or whatever, 25 years, have been the main distributor of US comics to not just America, but to UK and Europe as well. So, whereas back in the day, it might have been more kind of fragmented, and some shops get some stuff on the east side and some people get stuff on the west side type of thing. Back in the day where people might have had spinner racks in their shops, people remember picking up a Spider-Man or Thor or something like that. For us, it was more whatever we could, especially American comics anyway, before the comic shops came along, it was whatever people could dig out of a box somewhere that someone might have sold. But then in my time as a teenager, kind of late 80s, early 90s, um, that was a thing you could go in and you would always find Marvel, DC, Dark Horse, and then later on Image and Valiant and all those other ones as well. But
Have
yes,
any of the real classic British or in English comic books stuck around?
yeah, I mean the main one, well, probably the handful which still remain are 2000 AD. which has been going since 1977. And let me see, you still got, I think, Dandy and Beano, which are comedy comics essentially. So, which are generally aimed at like a younger audience. So kind of slapstick type of stuff. A lot of the comics that were around in the 70s and 80s, though the ownership of those characters and those titles have a good chunk of them anyway, have been recently bought by the same company who owns 2000 AD. It's a games company called Rebellion, a UK-based, Oxford-based company. So they bought 2000 AD in the year 2000. They've kept it going all the way through to the present day. And in the last few years, they have acquired different chunks of ownership of all these old kind of what they call legacy characters from these other comics and stuff. So, but I mean, that's the thing. It's a weird thing in the 60s and 70s and 80s where companies would bang out as many titles as they could, and whatever one was the most successful, that one would keep going, and then he'd merge the less successful ones into the successful one. So 2000 AD over its 40 odd year history is either about, I don't know, must be at least 8 or 9 different titles merged into it over time, and then they either get dropped and forgotten about, or some of those characters continue on. So
that's fascinating. I mean, I'm getting the gist that English comics and American comics were totally different. Like when you got American comics, they were just like, I mean, superheroes, right? You don't have superheroes in English comics. Is that a pretty accurate statement?
For the most part, yeah. I mean, if you do superheroes, it's kind of with a bit of a sarcastic or cynical bent, I would suppose you say. The most famous example would be Zenith, Grant Morrison's Zenith with Steve Yoel, who illustrated it over the years, and that was from, I think, the late 80s onwards. Where Zenith is basically just like if you imagine like a spoiled brat pop idol type of thing from the 1980s with big hair and big shoulder pads. And unfortunately, he's also the son of the two most powerful superheroes from the 60s. So Grant Morrison did several books over that. It kind of, at the time, 2000 would never do anything to do with superheroes, really. That wasn't what their kind of stuff was. But this was a different take on it. And then you've got that kind of almost mirroring that timeline, mirroring with Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen and those types of things going on in America as well. Kind of more mature take, I suppose you would say, on superheroes at the time.
Dark Knight's Return. I mean, that was a departure from Batman completely, wasn't it? It was kind of interestingly drawn and just more comic-y.
Yeah, I mean, Dark Knight Returns itself, I mean, if you look at Frank Miller's work from, say, late 70s, early 80s, all the way through Daredevil, it's kind of building up to Dark Knight Returns. Not just in terms of his writing, but his style of drawing as well. And there's other books he did, like Ronin, which is, to me, still one of his best books. But he's one of these, brilliant people who's a writer and artist who dabbled with the mainstream for 10 years and then started going more towards stuff that he'd rather do personally, like Ronin and then Sin City and 300 and those later on. So it's fascinating when you follow a writer or an artist and you see the progression of their style over those years. And majority of the time, people tend to gravitate to doing their own stuff anyway. They've kind of, what's the best way? They kind of got their feet wet in the mainstream, and then kind of, well, actually, I want to try and do this type of stuff. Mike Mignola is another good example of that, who created Hellboy. He did quite a bit of work for DC and Marvel in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, and then he said himself he just likes to draw monsters. So he drew a monster, and Hellboy became this big hit. And I was lucky, actually, that came out at the time when I started getting into American comics myself, actually. So I've been with that all the way through for the past 20, must be 25 years now, actually, Hellboy.
It's almost like you didn't have a choice, right? I mean, it's almost like American comics just washed everything else out, and now all you have is superhero movies and superhero comics and things of that nature. Do you feel like the indie scene is washed out? And that unless you're kind of embraced by these big guys, then kind of you're going to struggle making a name for yourself and gathering an audience?
No, I don't think so. I think we're quite lucky these days in that we're almost in a golden age of comics where people can seek out, well, have a massive variety of stuff to look for. In comic shops, the way comic shops work, they have to buy in stock that they hope will sell because they're paying for that upfront. That's not sale or
Hmm.
return. So it's always a gamble for anything that they get into a shop, but they know there's going to be a core audience for Marvel and DC stuff. And the indies are a bit of a hit and miss sometimes, as they always are. So when you get the Image books, the big example everyone uses of The Walking Dead, which was a creator-owned book for Image, and that became this massive success. So everyone's looking for the next version of that. But then if you look at, say, what Image are doing, Dark Horse, IDW, all the other different publishers that are out there, some of them are doing really, really interesting stuff that you would think you would never get to see in comics, whether that's because it's pretty far out ideas, philosophy, or sex or violence, whatever it may well be. So stuff that wouldn't be allowed in the kind of early teens oriented version of DC or Marvel. So you've got this stuff on the fringes for the people who want to go looking for it. But in terms of making a success out of it, it's a weird way. I'm not sure how people manage to do this. Just every now and then something just catches on to people's imagination and people run with it and becomes popular. Whereas if you're a couple of years early or a couple of years late, it might not have caught on quite the same way.
I mean, what are you talking about? The zeitgeist, right? I mean, you have no clue how
Zeitgeist type
things.
of thing, yeah, exactly. You
Yeah,
just never know what's going to.
how do people get into stuff? How do they get interested in things that? I mean, like, yeah, you release something and then you're wondering how does it blow up?
Yeah.
I mean, I look at your website. You're working on one of those big gigantic things, right? I mean, Star Wars is one of those commodities that came out of nowhere. It was a dark horse. It wasn't supposed to be a financial success.
Yeah, exactly. It was like a little indie. Well, people thought it was just like a silly little kids film when they were making it, but yeah, it was essentially like an indie director. We've done two films, THX and American Graffiti beforehand.
And then
So that
bam,
was
knocked
yeah,
it out of the park. And everybody knows the story. His wife helped him edit it. The story was laughed at by his director buddies. There's just like every other movie that he's done since like Empire Strikes Back has kind of sucked. But still, he hangs on to it. That thing is just like lasted forever. Nobody else can make a space movie without it being compared to it.
exactly. You have these big milestones in culture. That's definitely one of them. And again, for me, from being from that era as well, Star Wars has always been. It's always there. I mean, although I'm doing official work for Tops at the moment, which is Star Wars, it goes right back to my earliest memories are reading Star Wars comics. So those two things have always been entwined. It's always been Star Wars and comics together.
That was Marvel too, wasn't it? Back in the
Yeah,
day.
Marvel UK reprints. Yeah. So when I was a kid, my dad used to work for a company that would distribute magazines and comics and newspapers to
Cool.
lots of different shops in the Northwest. So he would come back at the end of the week with a massive big stack of papers and magazines and comics. So I didn't know how lucky I was at the time. And one
Yeah,
of those
man,
was
I'm
Star
sitting here
Wars.
thinking, geez, when I was a kid, that would have been like my dream.
We didn't
That would have
have
been my
much, but we
dream,
did have that at the very least.
right? My God, that would have been so cool. Your house is probably a fire trap, right? But you got every
Oh, yeah.
edition of everything. How
I
cool
wish
for you.
I wish I would have kept a lot of those, but there wasn't that much room in my house, unfortunately.
I thought about an interesting question. Do you consider Star Wars an English film, or is it American?
I think it's an odd one now, isn't it? It is an American film. Although it's a classic good versus evil archetypal type story.
Mm-hmm.
Even though there's so much of an English influence on it in terms of
It's like 50% of it's filmed in your country. Like
yeah,
every film, 50% of it's filmed in your country.
yeah.
I think it's fascinating. I mean, as a kid, I was like, oh, this is like a foreign film. It's an independent foreign film. It's distributed by studios. How is that? I mean, how did you feel about? I mean, what are you doing with them exactly?
With Star Wars.
Yeah.
Yeah, so with Tops do trading cards, and they do different sets based on usually the films that have come out, and they have different. So, like for Rise of Skywalker or Solo, and then they'll have sets which are going back to the earliest days in the 70s or the 80s, like Masterworks or Galaxy and things like that. So each set has a different criteria of what can be included in it. So some sets are just purely the saga films, episode 1 to 9. Some of them are one film only, and then some of them are literally everything. So the last one I've just done, Holocron, which will be out later in the year. We were allowed to do pretty much the entirety of Star Wars besides the stuff that's done to the comics.
Mm-hmm.
That's a separate thing entirely. So we were able to include the games Battlefront and what's the other game? Oh, Jedi Fallen Order. so we're able to include characters from that for the first time as well, which is quite cool.
That is
Uh,
pretty neat. I mean, the canon is so big.
yeah,
Is the art style pretty universal? I like what you've done here. I mean, it's
oh,
not
thank you.
like a normal trading card. It's kind of got that. I don't know. How would you describe it?
Well, for the sketch cards, everyone's got their own different technique. I use ink and watercolor when I draw. The earliest stuff, when I first started doing it, because I was so nervous of doing it for the first time, I just started off doing pencils, really. And then you kind of learn how the card that you're working on reacts to different materials. So when I knew I could use watercolor without damaging the card, then I started to use that. I find that quite easy to control. So there's other people who I know who work on these cards who might use oils or acrylics, or pastels and things like that, which are for that kind of size, 2 inches by 3 inches or whatever it is. It's very difficult to work controlled at that size and still maintain a likeness for an actor that you may
Oh,
be painting.
interesting. So you're actually you have the card, the size of the card in front of you, and you're
Yeah,
actually producing the art on it.
yeah, absolutely.
That's
Um,
interesting. I
yeah,
thought you would
so
have like a giant poster board size thing, and you take a
oh, good, I
picture of it
wish.
and they shrink it down or something like that.
We do get ones where people are invited to do. I can't remember the actual term for it now, but the artwork gets reproduced in the set, so that of the say 150 cards that you would collect, one of those cards will be an art card, and it'll be your painting that's included. What I do is the sketch cards, which are one of a kind. They're inserted into however many packs that they are. Generally, I do run about 50 or so per set that comes out. And then out of the thousands upon thousands of packs that go out across the world, someone somewhere will open that pack and hopefully find one of my sketches.
Oh, that's freaking neat. So I'm sitting here thinking I would love to get a whole set of these cards, but you're actually telling me that they're so special. Getting a whole set of them would probably be impossible.
Well, you get ones which have autographs in it as well from the actors, or and you get like pieces of material and things like that might be in there. Some have medallions, I think, or coins in previous sets. But yeah, these are just one of a kind ones
And
that
that's
go
pretty
in.
special too. I'm looking at your website, right? I'm looking at them. I think this is so cool that you got the opportunity to do this.
I was made up. I really was. The thing is, a friend of mine was working for them a couple of years before I started, and they were saying, "Just send your stuff in. Just send them some samples and see what they say." I'm like, "Oh no," because I was paranoid that they would say you're not good enough, and that's the worst thing you can say.
Right? It
As
is.
someone
It
who
sucks.
loves Star Wars, it's like, "Oh, you're not
As
good
a
enough to be
writer,
on."
man, that's all I get is rejection. Sorry. And there's not even like nice rejection. It's like, nope. This is a form letter. We just copied and pasted it. No,
Just
totally. I
stamp it
understand.
out it goes. Yeah. So he gave me eventually. I said, "Okay, give us the email address and I'll send stuff off." And then I sat on that for a good few months. But what I did in that time was I started to draw at that size just to see if I could actually physically do it, because I'm more used to drawing 11 by 17 for comic pages. So even though you're drawing small panels maybe on that page, you wouldn't ideally draw that small, especially if you're drawing something like a likeness for an actor. So I managed to do some, sent them off, and about 2 weeks later, I got a reply saying that they liked it and they wanted me on the next set that was coming out, which I honestly did not expect that in the slightest. I thought I'll never hear. I think they probably get thousands of people
Yeah.
email them every week with stuff.
Did you
But
ever
yeah,
find out how many people do send them stuff like that?
oh god, I have no idea. No, but I can imagine. There's a lot of people who would like to do that type of work. So, and there's some of the artists who work on this are absolutely outstanding.
But that's so, I mean, honestly, it's so like, it's not something that anybody thinks about. There are cards that are shoved into cards deck. You know what I mean? It's like, you're not like, oh, I'm going to be one of the guys that does one of those cards. I mean, it's probably so nuanced that nobody applies for it or something. I mean, that's probably really cool that that guy said that to you. It's
If it,
amazing where ideas come from, right? I mean, just random comment from somebody who has no desire to get into that industry, and all of a sudden you're drawing art for Star Wars.
Well, I mean, the thing with the cards. I mean, I remember years ago when I was in as a teenager and stuff, and I would see the posters advertising the cards coming out. I would never buy them. Wouldn't have the money for them. Quite expensive over here. But you would see us like Drew Struzan and Dave Dorman and people like that who I would look up to. I would idolize them and go, I'd never in a million years I'd be able to paint like them. But then likewise, there's probably going to be people not looking at my stuff, but looking at other people's stuff who's in there, who now would like to do that work, but may think they're not good enough. There's always this a quote from Ira Glass I remember reading years ago, and it's about the gap in between where your skill level is and where you actually want to be, where your ambition actually is. It's on YouTube. It's a beautiful, beautiful quote. And the reason why people get into creating, whether it's writing or drawing or music or acting or whatever it is that you're inspired by someone else who you look up to and you would like to be at their level. But your ambition at the time outstrips your ability sometimes, and you just got to keep on doing the work, basically put the hours in, and eventually you'll get to that point. But likewise, when you do get to that point, there'll be someone else behind you looking at you going, oh, I wish I could do that type of thing. You know, I wish I could play Layla on guitar, but my guitar work is pretty basic. I can't do bar chords or anything at all like that. Whereas I look at, you know, a mate of mine who can do it and go, bloody hell, do you do that? So we just do the hours, you just practice.
Hours in. It's great advice for somebody actually looking at getting into the creative side of things, entertainment, storytelling.
The worst companies will ever say is no. They're not. They may say you're not really what we're looking for, or you're not quite at the standard that we would have. But that's just a challenge to get better. That's not saying you're worthless. You know, it's like actors go in for an audition and go, we really like it, but you're not quite right for this role.
Yeah.
It's like, well, that doesn't mean you're a bad actor. It just means that you're not quite right for that role at that time. You just move on to the next one.
Well, tell me about your training going in. You said you went to college. Did you study art? Did you study this thing that you do now, or what did you go to school for?
Yeah, so in England we have what you would call high school, secondary school, so which you would normally leave at the age of 16, and then we have A levels, which are the next step in between that and college. So I did 2 years A level art and a couple other subjects, and then went to college for a year doing a foundation course, which basically means you have a taste of everything, really, everything from printmaking to fine art, which is usually painting, sculpture, photography, all that type of stuff. And at the time, because I was quite young and stupid, I just wanted to learn technique. I wasn't interested in the why someone paints something. That wasn't what I was interested in at the time. And I wasn't learning that in fine art. It was someone standing behind you going, why have you done it that way? So I don't know. I've just woke up and I've got a hangover. Why are you asking me? So in the end, I focused on illustration. So illustration where you're working to a specific brief that someone gives you, whether it's for a book cover or a poster, whatever it may well be. That seemed a bit more practical. It's like, oh, I can learn how to do this stuff. But in the end, for college, for that year, all I learned was how to play pool in the student union and drink quite a lot. That was pretty much it. So then I changed my mind, go to university for 3 years doing fine art. Again, useless at it, didn't know what I was doing, too young. What I did learn was there's certain stuff that you pick up from other artists that you're working with. They go, oh, what's the technique you're using there? Or, you know, stuff like that. You can kind of watch people, how they do it. But the main thing really was just copying people that you admire and trying to work out how they've got to that point where something's in print in front of you. So I would look at other comics, artists I would look at, like Alex Ross, Alex Ross is best known for people who don't know him. American comic book artist based in Chicago. He's been painting probably the last 35 years or so. Probably best known for Kingdom Come and Marvels. But he does a very kind of photorealistic type of style.
Oh, he's the guy who did Marvels?
Yeah, Marvels.
Oh, yeah, okay. I really like him a lot. I like that book anyway. Marvels is really good.
It is. It's really, really good. And that was one of his early stuff. He's like in his early 20s when he did that. It's sickening how talented he is. But he's, over the years, there's a romanticism almost to his work. It's not like pure photographic style. So you can see, usually with an artist, especially a comic book artist, you just need to look at the eyes, and you can usually see the artist in the eyes, because a lot of artists use themselves as a reference. And he uses a lot of photos of himself dressed up or wearing a certain type of glove or whatever. So I would look at their work, and then I would also look at, because of the studies I was doing in fine art, look at like the Renaissance, like Michelangelo or Caravaggio. So those artists who, especially Michelangelo, where you look at the Sistine Chapel and all the figures are very almost super heroic in their proportions anyway. They've all got rippling muscles and holding things up and stuff. And Caravaggio was more, for me, the kind of the composition, the violence, which is in a lot of his paintings, the contrast of light and dark, that type of thing. So all those kind of things kind of feed into it, and eventually comes out your interpretation of that type of stuff in your work. But in terms of actual technique, a lot of it was stuff I learned in high school with a couple of art teachers, and just using traditional tools like dip pen and ink, brushes, I say watercolor. I'd love to do oil paintings, but they take a long time to do, and I don't have the space for it, unfortunately.
Mm.
But I'll get around to that one day. But yeah, a lot of it is just practice, throw it in the bin, practice, throw it in the bin, and eventually you get to something which is usable, I suppose, the best way to put it.
That's, I guess, a problem with it, isn't it? It's expensive to practice with art,
It
like
is.
painting and drawing. I mean, you have to buy the pencils, you have to buy everything that go along with it. I mean, I got 10 fingers, and I wasn't even using all of them for most of my writing career, just like 3 of them, and my
Just,
thumbs.
just one of those, yeah. I'm exactly the same. But the thing, I mean, with art as well, there's a weird. It's like trying to learn an instrument. So you don't have to spend $1,000 on a Les Paul to learn how to play guitar. You just get a cheap acoustic to learn how to do things. And if you like it, you'll start to progress on. The same thing with art materials. You can hopefully school, at least in the UK anyway, most schools would provide the students with brushes and pens. I've still got stuff I used at the age of 12. That's how long this stuff tends to last. Dip pens and pencils and things. But most people have a pen or a pencil and access to some paper, and that's where you start. Some of the best cartoons and the most successful cartoons are really simply drawn.
No, it's very true. What is it called? Yeah, there are so many simply drawn things out there that are just so human in their storytelling. It's just magnificent. Persia, what was that the name of the book that came out about 10 years ago?
Oh, Persepolis, I think.
Yeah, thank you.
Martin.
So beautiful and so simple.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
But sometimes, I mean, that's the best way
Blanket.
to get the message away. Yeah, Blankets by Craig Thompson, I think it was. You don't have to have photographically realistic artwork to get the message across. Sometimes something is like 2 or 3 lines, Charlie Brown, Snoopy, things like that, will get the image across or the story across straight away, or the emotion across, you should say. Because what I try and do anyway, or what I'm aiming for, is to give someone an emotional response to my work that I have with the work of Alan Moore or the work of Grant Morrison or Alex Ross and so on, Kurt Busiek and people. I'll read an issue of Astro City by Kurt Busiek, and I can't remember the artist's name now. It'll come to me later on. And it'll just be like a one-off. There's one. Are you familiar with Astro City? Sorry, that's all.
No, the name is very familiar, and I might have actually bought a copy of it once, a long time ago, but I don't think I've read it.
It's a kind of a
It's crazy, isn't it? It's crazy, isn't it? It's a lot of the art is like all over the place. He kind of really tiny mini things are going on all over.
Yeah,
I remember.
and
am I right?
and Alex Ross does the covers, and then the artwork is done by a different artist who I forget the name of. Sorry, but a lot of those times it started off as like a love letter, really, to kind of the golden age or the silver age of comics in America. There's a mountain in there called Kirby Mountain, for example, things like that. But there's also a lot of there's a one-off story where a man wakes up and he can't get this image of a woman out of his head, and he can remember the smile, he can remember the sound of a laugh and the way her hair smells and things like that. But no one else knows who this woman is. He's gone, who did they go to school with her? It's like, no, I have no idea who he's talking about. Family, friends, people he's worked with 20 odd years ago. And no one seems to remember who this woman is. And it's driving him absolutely mad. And then the hanging man, who's a character, is like a supernatural character in Astro City, kind of knocks on his window and goes, we need to have a talk. He goes, why? What's the matter? Well, basically, the woman that you're imagining was your wife in a previous reality. But what happened was we had this big interdimensional war. We had to reset reality. And unfortunately, there were some casualties, and one of those was your wife. So we can either wipe your memory completely so you never remember her, or you basically keep it to yourself because we don't want other people starting to remember people that they've lost as well. So this was about 20 years ago. This one particular story was in, and then every now and then they've gone back to that character again. And like 20 years later, he sets up like a help group for the other people whose wives or brothers or sisters or kids have disappeared in this interdimensional kind of crossover reset thing. But we reading it, and it's like really emotional because it's not about people beating each other up in an alleyway or throwing buildings at each other. It's about this man going, I've lost my wife, and no one remembers her, only me. So that kind of emotional, an example of an emotional connection that you have with a story, whether that's a film or a book or a comic, well, that's the ideal for me to kind of aim towards, that someone else has that emotional response to what I've done, the same way that I have a response to that. There's a brilliant book that a couple of articles that were later collected into a book that Alan Moore did in the 80s. basically how to write comics is
Mm.
the broad title of it. But one of those things always stuck in me was like, how do you write how do you write horror? What is it that people are scared of? So, well, for me, this is Alan Moore basically speaking. For me, horror is not werewolves and vampires. It's real world stuff. It's it's the famine in Africa. I look at that and I see a kid starving to death in the middle of a desert. I think that could be my child. That terrifies me. How can I protect my child from being left hungry or being left in a war zone or something like that?
He
So
did
that,
V for Vendetta, didn't he?
yeah,
Yeah, Alan Moore did V for Vendetta, and that
yeah,
makes sense because I mean he's not in Africa, he's in England. How is he going to write about his child starving? He writes about this dystopian government,
yeah.
controlling everything. It's brilliant in a way. I mean, he's never going to understand that child enough. You know what I mean? He's intelligent enough to know his characters have got to come from his own world.
Well, you can imagine. I mean, again, it's taking that the perspective, the empathy of it. It's like, well, if that was my child, how would I feel? What would I do to protect that child? So, in Europe for the past 10 years or so, a lot of European countries are still dealing with refugees coming from Syria and other places like that who are escaping a war zone, they're escaping a famine, totalitarian governments, and all the rest of it. And all they want to do is save their kids. They're trying to get to a better life. Um, a lot of them end up drowned on beaches of Spain and islands and Italy and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, I can look at those pictures and go, if my child was in a war zone, you would do anything to get out of that position to get to a better place. If the water, as there's something Benedict Cumberbatch actually said a couple of years ago when he was doing a bit of a charity thing, so that if the water is safer than the land, you go to the water, and that's the position a lot of these people are in. So you can write stuff which has that in mind. So a lot of the stuff which I've written in the past 10 years, I've got dozens of projects on different types of stages, is written from the perspective of one way or another being a parent, because I've got a 12-year-old daughter.
Mm.
So it's always been anything before that. I look at that and it's really juvenile. It's like, oh, I'm trying to emulate another writer or something else. But everything I've wrote since is from that perspective, whether it's being a father for the first time or being in a position where you are in a society that's starting to fall apart.
And the
So
more you write about
mhm.
that position in life, the easier it becomes to identify what it is exactly you're trying to tell. I mean, yeah, you
Yeah,
want to tell about being a father, but in actuality, you want to dig deeper and really kind of discover the humanity behind it because people interact with fathers and
yeah.
daughters and mothers, and it's all
I
that
think
about. It's
there's
important.
this thing where the more specific you write, the more universal that story becomes. So if you're writing about a very specific thing that happened to you, like Persepolis is a good example, where it's been a long time since I read the book. She grew up in Iran during the revolution, if I remember rightly. So she kind of saw the turn of it. Um, so revolutions happen all the time. You can relate to being fearful for your child or fearful for your parents or someone speaking out and they get chastised for it or thrown in prison for it or whatever. Now, V for Vendetta was written at a time during Thatcher's Britain in the early 80s. Thatcher's to put it mildly, quite a divisive figure in Britain. There's people of the working class, like I am, from Liverpool and the north, who were quite badly affected. Well, the area was quite badly affected by the policies that Thatcher brought in the 80s. And then there's people on the right-hand side, the right-wing side of politics, who look at her as a bit of a saint. Um,
And we got our own here as Reagan. You know what I mean? Same kind of
yeah,
situation.
yeah, they're very much of
Yeah.
the same time, weren't they? The Iron Lady, we called her. So V for Vendetta is written at a
It's
time when,
interesting how they both kind of died with dementia, right? Both have Alzheimer's. They don't remember anything. I find that so fascinating about
yeah,
both
I
the
mean,
end of their existences.
I can imagine as well, again, because they were only human, doing that type of job. I mean, you look at any president usually, when they go in and when they leave, 8 years later or 4 years later, they've aged in like 50 years. Especially you look at Obama now and he's got white hair and, incredibly wrinkled face and so on. Um, but as an example of kind of using your environment or what you're growing up in at the time. So Alan Moore was writing V for Vendetta during that time when you've got Maggie Thatcher was suggesting putting people who were suffering from HIV into camps so that they couldn't infect anyone. Um, Horrific stuff to do with society at the time. So he just took it as a logical extension. It's like, well, okay, how bad can things get, and how is that going to affect my family, and how terrifying can that become? So at the time, a fascist government as kind of swinging back to the right as it did in the 30s, was a terrifying prospect as it is now. And you could see the steps that could quite easily lead to that outcome. So you've got in that book, it's not about Evie or V himself. It's about the argument between anarchy, which is represented by V, and fascism or totalitarianism, which is by Norsefire on the other side. So although it may be at the time seeming quite a far-fetched type of idea sliding into fascism, it's still very much based on what he was experiencing at the time. He's got daughters himself. He's looking at the world around him going, my God, what can I do? His outlet is writing. I've said this to a few people who are non-comic people or non-creative people. It's like everyone experiences the world and needs to express how they feel about the world, but not a lot of people know how to do it or have the tools to them to do it. Some people write, some people do music, some people act or whatever. But and for me, it's for comics. That's my medium, for want of a better term. So I want to try and get this stuff down. If no one, this is the weird thing as well about comics, where especially indie comics, going back to what we were saying before about small press and indie comics, the vast majority of people don't get into comics to make money. They do it because they've got something that they need to say and get off the chest. There may be just one or two things that do, and then they'll disappear back to normality. For others, they'll just keep on doing it until maybe they get picked up by Marvel or DC, or to get a Walking Dead type of deal, or whatever it may well be. But at the end of the day, most people get into creative work of some kind because they have to express how they see the world and how it's affected them. And for some people, it might be just one piece of work that stands the test of time, and they can move on to something else. They've got it out of the system. But definitely for me, it's always been looking at the world as a parent and thinking how, in different situations, I might deal with things in that situation, or a person who might not be suited to be a parent might deal with things in that situation. So I'm always fascinated myself where if I'm reading something, it's like, well, okay, how much is this about theme? How much is it about plot? How much is it about character? And if I know a lot of indie people in comics, I've become really good friends of mine over the past 20 years as well. So I know the people all the time who are doing the work and go, yeah, I can see what you were saying there, type of thing. So and that's the beauty of indie stuff. There's no filter there. You can do what you want. It's not a corporate person standing over your back saying you can't say this because this might alienate.
Yeah, that's why I like it. I like that.
Yeah.
I don't like anybody changing. I mean, but then you have all those parts that they spend so much money on. You know what I mean? Like we talked about it earlier, the distribution, the marketing, the inker or whatever. They make money to be able to afford their mortgages. They're professionals. You miss that because you're just making, you're doing it for one person. Yeah, I mean, I find it fascinating, and the world's different now. Whatever we had going into, the beginning of 2020 is, I don't think we're going to end the year in the same way. You know what I mean? People aren't going to be able to recover, I don't think. Right? I mean,
it's one of those things that people will look back in 5, 10, 20 years and go, it was a changing point in history, the same way the Spanish flu was or the Second World War was. We may not have the same death toll as what's happened, but it will have shown the inadequacies of whether it's the healthcare systems in different countries, the politicians in different countries, and then even down to what might be seen as a pretty inconsequential element, which is distribution of comic books, for example. So, everything came to a stop kind of February, March time of books that would have gone out to comic shops across the world, as a lot of other stuff did. And it's like, well, it's comic books, it's not saving people's lives. But at the end of the day, there are still people's jobs on the line. People start to pay mortgages, they start to feed the kids. And just extrapolate that throughout all the other industries. Like today, or last night, in my area of the country, in the northwest, around Manchester area, we're now into a second lockdown, essentially, because the cases have increased again. And that's purely because the messaging from the government has been so mixed. It's like, you can go out, but don't go out. But if you want to go out, spend money. But if you want to spend money, do it with a couple of friends, but only a couple of friends. But if you are going to go out, make sure you spend money.
For me, it was my kids. We went to the park the other day, and they're 5, so they can't wear a mask. They're just impossible to get them to wear a mask on. I'm sure it's down by their chin, or you find it 20 feet away on the floor. They just refuse to wear masks. So you take them to the park because you can't keep them inside all the time. And they get a little sniffle. They get a little bit of a fever. It's like, Jesus Christ, I can't beat this thing. You're in New York, and we're down low now. We're keeping other places away, but I know it's going to happen again too. And it's interesting that you say, like, people like yourself, you don't need anybody. like Marvel, they had to take months and months off from drawing Spider-Man because they couldn't. Were they able to produce? Were comics able to put stuff out during the quarantine, or are they
Um,
now like backlog?
well, with the big companies like DC and Marvel, there's a pipeline really. So you have people who are writing stuff, drawing stuff, inking stuff, coloring it, printing it. So there's different stages that they go through. So I imagine there was a bit of a backlog to get through. So they probably said people just down tools for the time being until we know when we can get stuff back out again. Because at the end, they still have to pay people to do those things, and there's no point paying out money for stuff that may not be able to be put into shops for a good number of months later. So it's like a domino effect all the way through.
Hmm.
I imagine there's probably some stuff which was ended up online or like digital versions that they do. I mean, the TV industry, especially over here, where um, there's been a load of repeats of stuff, like repeats of sporting events, repeats of game shows and things like that, because they've not been, all the dramas have stopped filming, like the soap operas and stuff like that. So it's like, well, we do have a massive back catalogue of stuff we can show anyway. It's not as if people are going to go, bored because there's nothing on the telly. And the
But
same thing with,
you can produce new stuff. I can produce new
well,
stuff. I mean, we're not stuck with somebody going, okay, well, I can't because I'm not watching you or something along those
true.
lines.
To a certain extent. I mean, my situation is my partner. She works for the NHS, so she's not stopped working at all. She's been
Oh,
quite
yeah,
busy
it's tough.
these
It's
last
tough.
few months. So I've been usually I would work from home anyway, or from a studio, which is about 10 minutes walk from where I live. Um, and I would normally work through the night because that's my kind of my default thing is work through the night. So when my daughter's in school, I can sleep through the day and be awake when she goes to school and when she comes back. But now I'm awake through the day, so my work has massively slowed down. I mean, it's great for other people who aren't in that position. I've got a few mates who don't have kids themselves, so they can just learn how
Do
to
whatever they
play the
want.
violin or whatever. But when you've got a kid at home who is homeschooling as well, because all our schools shut in March, um, and that's you've got the physical aspect of how do you help your child learn? She's 12, so she's at the beginning of high school. And then you've got the mental health aspect of, well, she can't see any of her mates for it's been 3 months before she can see them again. She's basically just stuck in the house all day. I'm stuck in the house. I don't want to infect other people, maybe asymptomatic. I don't want obviously my family to be infected at all. I've got, our parents, mine and my partner's parents are both in the high risk thing as well. So we're on Zoom calls with them every day, making sure they're all right. So all that stuff kind of weighs on you. And
Yeah.
there's a few people I've spoke to go, it would be nice to sit down and do some drawing or do some writing or whatever, but I just can't because it's this weight which is on people's minds. It's like, what's going to happen next? Am I going to have a job? Is my partner going to be made redundant or all these types of things? So for people who are able just to sit down and do it, it's brilliant. I really do envy people who have been able to do
You
that.
know what it
And
is for me? What I'm doing right now is like a third rewrite on something, and I hate it so bad that I'm not going to quit. I
yeah,
hate this novel so bad that I'm not going to stop writing until I'm done with it. And then I'm going to inflict the world. I'm going to just infect the world with the novel that I hate. That's my goal. That's
excellent.
what I'm doing it for. I hate it so much. I can't wait for it to be done, man. So what's on the itinerary for you going forward? Do you have anything that you're excited about that you've got coming up?
Yeah, so the main thing which I've got on the board at the minute is a 4-issue miniseries, fully painted miniseries called Lytton, which is from a company called Cutaway Comics, which is an indie in the UK. And it's written by a writer who used to work on Doctor Who over here,
Oh,
the classic
cool.
Doctor
That's why I reached
Who.
out to you, man. I saw Doctor Who and I got real excited. I didn't read a single thing after that until I got motivated to talk to you. And I said, where the hell does
Brilliant.
Doctor Who thing go? As I have read it back a little bit, it's like, oh, okay, that's why. That's exciting. Are you a Doctor Who fan?
I am, yeah. One of my earliest memories is watching Tom Baker fall from Jodrell Bank, which isn't that far away from where I live, actually. It's a radio telescope in Cheshire. Um, so yeah, I used to watch it with my dad when I was young. When we were able to watch it on the telly, because one telly, 5 people in a house, and everyone wants to watch something different. Tom Baker was my original Doctor, and then when everything restarted in 2006 with Chris Eccleston, um, then sat down with my partner watching that, and then my daughter came along in 2008, so she's grown up with Matt Smith really as her Doctor. So it's always been definitely there. It's one of these cultural it's through Britain like a stick of
Yeah.
rock, basically. Doctor Who.
I
Everyone knows it, even
knew
if they've never watched it.
I knew Tom Baker through my dad when I was a kid. You know,
Mhm.
PBS, we had them available there. That's the only Doctor I knew. And then Chris Eccleston
Yeah.
popped it out. And David Tennant's the only one I really pay attention to now. I think he's the best. But I think it was just a companion. I think I just liked his companions.
Yeah. That's the thing with Doctor Who. It's always the stories that work the best, or the Doctors that work the best. It's seeing the Doctor through the companion's eyes.
Mm-hmm.
And I've done a few fan stories of Doctor Who, which eventually I'll get around to drawing. But the general idea, the Doctor makes people better in whatever way they need to be made better. So you look at Catherine Tate's character Donna, who is just like a ditzy secretary type of person who's just gossiping all the time, and then she ends up saving the entire universe. So there's the characters or the companions go on a journey the same way that, and we learn the Doctor, that current version of the Doctor, through the companion's eyes. Whereas if it becomes a Doctor-centric type of thing where we see everything through his eyes, doesn't quite work as well, I don't think. But the best ones, when you're emotionally involved with, like, I love David Tennant. He was brilliant. I'll be honest, I cried my eyes out when he regenerated. I was a mess on the floor after that. So I'm like really emotionally invested in Doctor Who.
Well, didn't he go
obsessed
with his partner though? Didn't they split him or something, or was that the season before? I can't remember. It's been so many years. Did they split him? He had like one version go off with Billy Piper and
Yeah. So there was an episode where he cut off his hand, or a hand was cut off in the first episode he was in, and he during a version where he was shot by the Daleks, he was about to regenerate, but instead he just used enough to heal himself, and then sent the rest of the regeneration energy into this hand that was in a jar, which grew a non-Time Lord version of David Tennant's Doctor. So I think it's Journey's End is the actual episode, the title. Billy Piper goes to the parallel Earth where her family are, and takes the human version of David Tennant with her, so that she can have a normal life as opposed to pining after the Time Lord Doctor. So somewhere on a parallel Earth there's still a human version of the David Tennant's Doctor. But it's
I don't think they're
the
together still. I cannot see a human version of the Time Lord going over well with anybody.
That's true. Well, it's like it does kind of lose the appeal if you can't have a TARDIS
Right.
to go around time and space. Yeah,
You make so many mistakes for a human being. I just don't see it happening very well. But yeah, that was a great story, right? I cannot finish the other guy. Who's Matt Smith? I have not finished his whole. I've got right up to where he's supposed to regenerate, and I'm excited to see the Lady Doctor. No, it's not the Lady Doctor. The Lady Doctor is a brand new one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm like 2 doctors behind now, and I don't know what to do about it besides watch the show.
Just watch the show, yeah, and
Just watch the show, yeah.
try and avoid any kind of as much as people can do these days, avoid spoilers. But that's the great thing about Doctor is that every Doctor is completely unique. It's still the Doctor, and you can still see echoes of, like, Peter Capaldi. Every now and then I'll hear a bit of Tom Baker in his voice, and the same thing with
classic. I mean,
everyone loves Tom Baker. He's brilliant. But then you just see little echoes of the Doctors who've come before. But everyone's a new start. It's another chance for someone else to jump on board. And if you do go back and watch the old ones, all the way back through to William Hartnell, you'll still be rewarded by it, and you just see a reflection. William Hartnell's Doctor is like a grumpy old man type of thing, and at times comes across a little bit sexist, perhaps too, because of the time it was written.
It was 60s.
60s, exactly. It's like, you're scared. It's far too short, young lady. I'll put you on my knee and give you a spank bottom. Those types of things. So, and yeah, now we're up to Jodie Whittaker. So it just by its very format just reinvents itself for every generation that comes along and enjoys it.
I love it. Would you be able to recreate Doctor Who stories without getting into some kind of copyright issue, or is it still kind of?
Oh yeah, like anything copyrighted, really. If it's a fan work, then The weird thing is, back in it must have been the early 90s, or in between the end of Sylvester McCoy's run, when it was cancelled on the BBC, and then the beginning of, and the Paul McGann TV movie. So there was some books with, like, The Professor, it was called, which was basically Doctor Who, but just a different name. So there were people who published these types of books or audio ventures using a similar type of format, a time traveling professor as opposed to a time traveling doctor. I mean, the ones I've done, I would do just because there's a story there which I really like to get down on paper. And if anything comes of it, let's use it as a sample to show to the publishers or to someone else. That'll be fine. I mean, what I'd like to do at some point is I've got little one-off stories for Star Wars or Battlestar Galactica or Star Trek and things like that. Is eventually just put them in like a big book or put them online for free for people to read. So providing you don't make money from them or you're not asking for money for them, then generally I think most people will be quite happy with it. There's plenty of fan art out there, plenty of fan films. Fan films are a good example because there's tons of fan films about Star Wars, and the general rule is as long as you don't make money from it, then we're absolutely fine. So I mean, I've worked on a couple of fan films myself based on Judge Dredd and Strontium Dog in the UK. And as long as it's not for profit, no one's getting any profit out of it, then it's fine. And for like the Judge Minty one, which is the Judge Dredd fan film I worked on about 10 years ago now, it must be. We were in the middle of a Welsh slate mine, chucking it down with the rain, completely soaked through 5 layers of clothing, on my knees, with broken bits of stone and glass. And I was as happy as I could be,
Right.
because I was doing a fan film, and I was amazing.
That's so cool, man. I saw that Judge Minty thing in there. I saw the film work that you do too. Yeah. That's really exciting. I'm happy that we had an opportunity to talk. I mean, you're an exciting creator and you're doing a lot of cool stuff right now. Where can people find you on the World Wide Web?
Yeah, well, my main portfolio site is just barryrenshaw.co.uk. And I'm on Twitter as Art of Baz and Instagram as Engine Baz. They're the main ones I'm on, and I do have a Facebook page as well, which is just Barry Renshaw Art of. So yeah, just Google Barry Renshaw and there'll be a link will come up on that.